Hunter. Thank you both for two fantastic papers. You can.
Thanks.
Some crossovers there and the whole satanic, pantheistic, ecofeminist world. So
Yes, I think so.
Got lots of comments or questions. Who would like to start?
Yeah. It's really wonderful to hear someone talking about Lolly Willows. It's one of my absolute favourite books. I love Sylvia Townsend Warner. And I guess I want to ask you a question specifically, but perhaps you might have something to say to this as well. Just that it struck me as you were speaking how the countryside is being figured in Lolly Willows as this kind of space of liberation, right? And I was thinking that, not to read it too biographically, but that it is about kind of queer liberation, right? That
Yes.
It's about an escape from the family into the countryside, which then is kind of mirrored in a way in Sylvia Townsend Warner's own life, right? In her
Sure.
relationship with is it Valentine
Yes.
Auckland.
Yes.
And I guess it's just, I guess that's, if we're talking about the kind of early 20th century, it seems to me that kind of flips later in the 20th century, right, where the city becomes this space in which you go to be queer, right? You get away from the kind of conservative countryside and you move to the city. And I guess, I don't know if you just had any thoughts about kind of the way that the countryside is being thought about in Lolly Willows as this space to escape to, right, where that one can explore kind of greater freedoms there, whether they be cavorting with the devil or living with a lesbian partner.
Sure.
And whether, I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that.
Well, regarding the biographical dimension of it, at the time she wrote Lolly Willows, Sylvia Townsend Warner was supposedly not aware of her own homosexual inclinations, but was in fact in a relationship with a man. So, well, could be that she was sort of starting to discover that side of herself at the time. But there's definitely something going on with the queerness of the countryside, and her young male relative who comes to visit her, Titus, is in fact portrayed as very effeminate and sort of almost decadent. But then he leaves this village when he partners up with a woman and sort of perhaps repudiates his own homosexual inclinations, and then he leaves the countryside and goes back to the city. And there's also a witch's Sabbath scene, which has some definitely quite queer elements in it. Yeah.
I guess I would add that I think you find a lot of representation of the countryside as a kind of a place of escape and freedom and liberty. But even if we're looking in the late 19th, early 20th century, with the decadence and the aesthetes, you're going to see all these men kind of thinking of having to be cosmopolitan, Parisian, London, that sort of thing. And so a very strong sense of the urban space as a draw for a place to establish one's sexuality even existed early on. I think both of these happen simultaneously.
I guess I was just thinking it's interesting with Lolly Willows where it's not the kind of wild countryside of, like, I don't know, Fiona MacLeod in the Highlands, right? It's a kind of English country village where you might think of it as being kind of
Perhaps subverting the conservative space in a way, and sort of, you think it's all conservative and cozy, but it's in fact they're witches, everyone in the village.
Yeah, and that's I would just bring in Arthur Mock in here with the Great God Pan and stuff like that. The countryside is always this farmland, pseudo-pastoral. That's where the Pan figure kind of shows up. It's not Fiona MacLeod or even the Romanticists, but it's a kind of a pastoral one. And then thinking forward to these short stories like The Man Who Went Too Far, The Man Whom the Trees Loved, all of those, even Saki short stories, is all very pastoral wilderness, right? So, and I think that distinction between the wilds and this kind of pastoral, I think is very interesting. This tepid sort of wildness for the pastoral. I think there might be something there, but I'm not sure.
Can I just say, I recently read Lolly Willows and struck by the fact that although it has this supernatural aspect, that it's very much a psychological novel, isn't it? In as much as these kind of fugue states that she suffers from, and where she goes into these kind of derive into urban areas and so on, this role for the Paddington goods yard and such like, and then they're kind of repeated in a pastoral context, aren't they? So it has a strong kind of element of a psychological struggle and an ambiguity about the supernatural aspect. Such as, for example, when she thinks she's cursed Titus, and he's being attacked
by bees,
supernaturally,
yes,
but it turns out that he was being pursued by bees or wasps or whatever. So there's an ambiguity in terms of the supernatural and psychological aspects.
Well, I know that it's been read as though, having this really strong ambiguity, but I think that if one looks really closely at the text itself, it becomes clear that there are several things that happen in the narrative that make it quite obvious that it's something supernatural is indeed going on, and it's not just all in the mind. But there's so many themes in this very rich novel, and another one is, of course, her fascination with collecting plants, and sort of the witch's connection to hallucinogenic plants and things like that. And that's a lot can be said about that as well.
Talks about strong herbs, doesn't she? And
Yes.
So that's an interest of my own, the aspect of the states and plants and their presence in.
Yes, I know.
I guess one other thing, because her relationship with the coven as well is quite ambiguous, isn't it?
It is,
the end, that it becomes completely unclear, really, whether she's going to join or not join.
Yeah, and that basically speaks to the sort of really individualistic ethos of the text. That it's not, you don't find a new place to belong, but you become a sort of liberated individual. You're not struggling together with others, you're just doing your own thing, really.
Hi. I was thinking, having read the novel, could you possibly say something about the role of Satan, what he does, what kind of his agenda is? Because you talked about how Satanism is for her way to emancipate herself, but then when she goes to the countryside and participates in the witches' Sabbath, and then Satan shows up in different forms. What does Satan want to do? What does he get out of this? So to say?
Well, let's put it this way: it's not entirely clear what Satan gets out of this. But the Satan who appears at the witches' Sabbath turns out to be an impostor. It's someone wearing a mask. And the real Satan instead appears as sort of an elderly man with a wrinkled face and dressed as a gamekeeper in a corduroy coat and so on. And he's a very sort of gentle figure, even quite passive in a way. And really, Laura takes the active role in all the conversations, and he just sort of gently teases things out of her and does that sort of thing, almost plays a sort of Socratic role.
Okay, is that perhaps also a bit of a conflation with Pan, because he is sort of like the guardian of the countryside a little bit? I think he is described as a guardian also in the novel, Satan, of her.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, certainly with some versions of Pan, and there are other ways of describing him.
The village participates in this Sabbath. Is it not like that? It's like secretly they go at night. It's not just her. It's
oh yes, yeah. The whole village participates in the Sabbath. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question. I'm interested. Both of you really were talking about asexuality in different aspects, figuring. In some sense, in your reading of those texts as being the most radical aspect of them, meaning that we don't have this binaristic man-woman dyad, but maybe something's interspecies, which is very interesting. But also for you, it seems as though that kind of asexual relationship between Satan and Lolly is some ways why the book seemed less radical than maybe it is.
Yeah, probably.
Because this comes out in 1926. This is the height of the satanic panic, or the Dancing Floor comes out. There's a bunch of like satanic panic novels that come out, but they're about men. And I'm wondering if there's an inverse relation there that helped to temper the relationship to that novel. But yeah, I guess my question is about the politics of asexuality in both of your readings.
Removing sexuality from the equation sort of makes things more palatable, I guess, to a broader public. What do you think?
Well, I mean, thank you for the question. It's sort of like, okay, can you talk a little bit more about what you're particularly interested in? And it is like I am finding the particularly curious thing for me in the study of the occult right now. Well, in my studies on the occult and paganism, the place of non-normative sexualities as a political gesture, as an avenue toward liberty, but I'm particularly interested in how it allows for a kind of environmentalism, if I really push it, but an eco-awareness that the romantic tradition of environmentalism doesn't speak to. Like, I'm seeing this as a different avenue to a different kind of sensitivity to humans' relationships to the landscape, right? And I think that came up in the first question as well. So that does lead one to notions of desire that function as primarily in the relationships, as opposed to in the individuals. I am an individual, and this is my sexuality, and now I will take it and maybe engage it with somebody else. Yeah. The sexuality seems to exist outside of the individual beings as relational qualities, which mean that they can be between humans and objects, as Vernon Lee and Kit and Strother Thompson were arguing, between humans and plants, which is kind of what Walt Whitman seems to angle toward, and people like Swinburne and Vernon Lee's Genius Loci. So there's a real strong potential for a type of queerness that exists in the landscape itself. And this could be urban, and it can be rural, and it can be pastoral, and I really find the pastoral one particularly fruitful for this, for some reason, which is great. But I do think that's where the politics lies, in relationality across sentient beings. And if your spirituality believes in the existence of the spiritualism, not only in human beings, but in other things, such as objects and plants and other animals and other forms of being, then it has to be the mediation that is most interesting and not the actual individuals. It works against the humanism of it all, right? The kind of anthropocentric humanism of the whole model. So that's what I find particularly exciting. I don't know if I answered your question because it raises so many interesting points, but I think in Lolly Willows you get that kind of energy as well, or the potential for that as well.
Definitely, and I think part of this sort of the subversive energy of the novel is that its heroine is a spinster, and she does not want to team up with someone and procreate. So it's not, don't go out and populate the earth. Instead, let the plants take over, perhaps. So it's like an eco-feminist critique of being centered on humanity dominating the planet. So it's definitely.
And that's why that kind of feminism, I think, has a particularly potent type of agency, because it then starts to argue for not defining what women are in relation to men, or we are equal to, like, do you really want to be equal to men? I'm not sure. Like, but it gives alternative possibilities for senses of mutual respect, right?
And also, can you think of another parallel with what you mentioned about the erotic relationship with plants? In a wonderful passage in the early part of the novel, when she's still in London, that's probably the closest you come to eroticism in this text, is when she goes and buys heaps and heaps of lilies. And it's very decadent. And she's completely taken with these flowers. Extremely decadent stuff.
Wow, it's amazing.
Great,
Thank you for great papers. Really enjoyed both of them. Question for you, Dennis, but how far do you think you can take that conceit of breath? Because, illness, aspiration, erotics. And thinking about poetry, it's all about breath, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I in a talk I'd given about a year ago, just on William Sharp and breathing. Like, I looked into his medical situation, and unfortunately he wasn't as sick as I made him sound. He had some issues with breathing, but nevertheless, he definitely was. It's really omnipresent in his notion of Suspiria. So it's spirit and breath, right? So that paganism. And when you breathe in the land, like you literally, physically are breathing in the landscape. And I think he recognized that as a lovely metaphor, especially like he ran around with the gypsies in his youth in the Highlands and stuff like that, right? And so with Sharp, it worked extremely well. And there's a few other authors whose poetry, the poetics, are built around notions of breathing and syntax very forcefully, even in the Victorian period. But to tie it into the spirituality, one has to try to build, and I think there's, like, I haven't done this work, and maybe more can be done, but other than Michael Field, often the kind of pagan poetics hasn't been analyzed with a respect for the alternative spiritualities. There's a tendency to say, it's symbolic, right? Paganism is a popular a thing, and so I'm using it as a metaphor, as opposed to saying, no, this person is actually serious, like Michael Field or or Sharp, that these people are actually, their poetics is their spirituality, and their spirituality is a non-normative spirituality. So that book has not been written, and the people who have worked on pagan spirituality, on paganism and poetics and spirit and breathing, tend to see the paganism as just kind of a metaphor, a symbol, and they haven't kind of brought an earnestness to it yet. So it's a fantastic field to build on. Yeah.
Can I just ask a very brief question, really, to both of you, I suppose, about this binding issue of the genius loci, or the spirit of place, and what Vernon Lee is doing with that. I mean, and this, I suppose, links to Townsend Warner. When Lolly goes to the village as well, I mean, can we make very historical and culturally specific references to where that village is? Because it seems to me that both Vernon Lee and Townsend Warner are interested in these kind of agricultural no man's lands. I think, especially for Townsend Warner, it's probably Dorset, or more broadly
the Chilterns,
Wessex, which would have been the richest archaeological real estate in the 1920s in Britain. So it's dominated by sarsen stones, cromlechs, cairns, various barrows, tumuli. And I wondered what's that saying about this idea of genius loci, because for someone like Algernon Blackwood or John Buchan, they often define the genius loci as a no man's land, as a sacred threshold. It's a place that you can't really step into except in a spirit of reverence and watchfulness. So maybe does this go back to Vernon Lee? Is she saying something about democracy, about elitism, about the exclusionary nature of the spirit of place, that only certain types have membership or affiliation with it, that they can only grant access to certain individuals, priestly figures?
I've been thinking about, like, various people have come to mind while you've been framing your question, and somebody like Arthur Machen and Hill of Dreams, he knows exactly where he's going, right? Like, it's historically utterly accurate to his homeland, and so for him, it's his place. I don't think he thinks everybody can have that sort of spirit there. And if you go to somebody like Vernon Lee, however, she's very pragmatic, and she has a couple of books on genius loci where she says, you know, that could be anywhere. That could be in the square next to your house. It can be in a public place. It can be your backyard. You can have a genius loci. You will find these in many places. And she almost at one point, when in the introduction, where I think it's the book Genius Loci, where she's kind of trying to cajole people to think about the landscape as their friends, and it sounds like she's talking about like a little rose garden in a muse or something. Like, it's so tiny, you know, it could be anywhere, and so, like that kind of thing. So she really has a practical voice to her genius loci. It's not inspirited. Even when she talks about the classical gods, she has a pragmatic bent to it. You know, do not personify this. I love, like, that is for me one of the queerest gestures in all the stuff I've been looking at, is this, please don't put a laurel ring on their heads and make them prance around in the woods. Just stop doing that, everybody, because Sharp was doing exactly that, and everybody else was. So I think each one of them would have a different answer to your question about that kind of gesture. You're totally right about Blackwood or something like that, but the others, both Machen and Lee, less so for Sharp, have this peculiar, very clear specificity for different very political reasons. You're totally right about the socialist bent of Lee, by the way, and motor cars and that kind of thing in her genius loci. Sorry.
Yeah, I think something somewhat similar applies to Townsend Warner, with sort of this theme appears already in the segment of the novel where she's still in London, where the nature sort of breaks through in cracks in the pavement and things like that. So it's this possibility to commune with nature somehow opens up already in the city itself. So it's not specifically linked to this geographical location she later arrives at. No.
Thanks.
Got time for one or two more questions? I have one. Help me understand Fiona MacLeod, because you mentioned 2 novels.
Yeah.
But in that 2-year period, there's like 7.
I know. I know.
So this is someone who is publishing a lot
Yeah.
of what sounds like quite turgid,
Yeah.
and what you're really pointing out is the whole point is there is no narrative momentum
Yeah.
to these texts. So this is the 1890s, this is at the height of the Gothic revival,
Yeah, you're right.
and obviously Sharp is doing this because it sells.
I would.
Does it? Why does it sell? Where do we put this in the story we have about the fiction of this time?
I think it's really. I mean, there's two ways one can ask that question. Like, I'm not Scottish, so I can't say bad things about Fiona MacLeod's novels.
Yes, you can.
Here.
Yes.
But they are for me a bit of a slog. And what I find interesting is, he first started to get popular when he started hanging around with poets. His Suspiria de Roma, he published it himself. It didn't do particularly well, although it's I think his best work. He publishes this thing called the Pagan Review, this periodical that lasts for one issue, and it turns out that all the contributors are actually him under different pseudonyms. And it's being reviewed in the States. And I'm like, how does somebody who nobody is reading suddenly get reviewed in the States in the very first issue of a periodical that only has him, the Black Madonna, the mystery of the Aztecs, like all these stories, and he wrote all of them. And so you read it and you go, okay, today I'm writing my next story, and just publish this mass thing. And then Fiona MacLeod's himself, right? And it's just over the top. And he wrote a ton, and it's so plush and rich, and you read one and then you read the next one, you go, but that was the one I just read. Like, why did you have to do this again? Don't you remember what you just published? Like, it's the same kind of thing. So there's, even in his career, it kind of lacked that sort of strong developmental momentum. I feel like a little bit like he was a lost soul. I think he was utterly committed to his Celticism, to the notion of Scots independence. He worked on the periodical The Evergreen, like he was a kind of like a ghost co-editor who never got credit by most. And then he would publish in The Evergreen, the Scots Independence Journal, as Fiona MacLeod and as William Sharp, right? And so he was carrying on both identities at the same time. Not that different, the two people. So I don't have an answer to your question. He didn't become wonderfully wealthy on these publications and things like that. Why it was published by John Lane in 1895, The Mountain Lovers, who's doing George Edgerton and all the kind of exciting stuff. But then, in that same series, you have Florence Farr getting published, and a couple of the other, Edith Nesbit, I think, another a Golden Dawn member who's in the John Lane series. So I think people were seeing a potential kind of radicalness in his writing at the time that basically never came to realization. And his wife had a strong influence on him, and I'm not saying it's a negative influence, but I think maybe together they were trying to build a type of Celtic spirituality that was more kind of sincere. And I sincerely think the career, he could have used a manager. I think it fell apart. He kept writing to the end, but it just kind of seemed to always meander in a half water or something like that, as opposed to getting into the main current. It's like it just didn't hit the mark.
If he'd gone Gothic with some of that material.
If he'd gone Gothic, it would be totally fine. And I mean, he's friends with Walt Whitman. He read in Canada. He went to Canada to do readings. He knew Pater and Swinburne and Rossetti's, and yet none of it, he stayed true to himself. He did. That's the way to put it.
Why you should never stay true to yourself.